The Case of the Library Ghost. Inspector Purbright. BBC radio drama. Evening had settled over Flaxborough with its usual deliberate quiet. The streets held that faint hum of after-hours domesticity, teapots, curtains, the last bicycle rattling home. Inside the library, the tall windows caught the final light and held it like old amber. Miss Denby, senior librarian for the past 27 years, moved with the serenity of ritual. She had long believed that order was the soul of civilization. Dusting, shelving, cataloguing. These were acts of devotion, not mere employment. The younger assistant, Margaret Hilliard, thought her a little too reverent, but admired her all the same. At precisely 7:45, the hush was broken. A sound, soft, deliberate, rose from the reference room. The gentle scrape of a chair moving, followed by a faint thud. Miss Denby looked up from her desk. "Margaret?" she called, though she knew the girl was shelving fiction. No answer. Crossing the carpeted floor, she reached the doorway and paused. The reference room was dim, the electric sconces half lit to save the council's pennies. The air smelled faintly of old bindings and polish. On the far table lay the Oxford Companion to English Literature, open, though neither woman had used it that evening. Miss Denby drew closer. The pages lifted and fell as if stirred by a sigh. Then, without a draught, without a breeze, the heavy book slid half an inch across the polished oak. Her breath caught. She stepped back so sharply that her shoe struck the skirting board. Within minutes, Margaret came running at the sound. She found Miss Denby pale, one hand pressed to her throat, pointing mutely at the book. The girl, more puzzled than frightened, touched the volume. It was cold. She laughed gently, trying to dispel the tension. "Perhaps it wished to be read, Miss Denby." The librarian did not reply. She only closed the book very carefully and locked the door to the reference room before sending Margaret home early. By the next morning, the tale had lengthened and warped. In the cafe opposite the library, Mrs. Blenkiron, who had once served on the library committee for 3.5 weeks, declared she'd always suspected a presence in that building. At the butcher's, someone claimed a light had flickered in the upstairs reading room long after closing. By noon, half the town agreed that the spirit of old Mr. Lavery, the previous librarian, dead these 5 years, had returned to claim his catalogues. Inspector Purbright heard the matter first from Sergeant Malley, who relayed it with a grin. "A haunting, sir. Books flying about, apparently. Mrs. Blenkiron says the library's possessed." Purbright, seated at his desk, looked up from a report on bicycle thefts. His grey eyes registered amusement rather than disbelief. Possessed? That would be a novelty for Flaxborough. Usually we manage our troubles quite without supernatural assistance. He leaned back, considering. Still, perhaps I'll stroll by this evening. Libraries, Malley, are curiously revealing places. People leave more behind them than overdue fines. At 7 that night, a faint drizzle silvered the pavements. The library, lit from within, looked almost theatrical, each window a warm rectangle against the damp dusk. Purbright paused outside, umbrella tucked neatly beneath his arm, and watched Miss Denby through the glass. She moved with measured care, shelving a volume, straightening another, glancing, once, briefly, toward the reference room door. It was locked. Inside, he noted a trace of unease beneath the decorum. The town, he thought, had already chosen its ghost. Flaxborough had a way of turning boredom into legend. A shifting chair, a whisper in the stacks. It would be enough to keep the teacups rattling for a fortnight. But Purbright sensed, beneath the surface, a quieter story, a loneliness that needed a shape, perhaps even a haunting, to make itself bearable. He smiled faintly, adjusted his hat, and moved on into the drizzle. Tomorrow he would call in, purely out of civic duty, to inquire after the spectral librarian. And thus began the case of the library ghost, not with terror, but with the smallest tremor in the calm. Morning rose pale and cold over Flaxborough, the kind of light that seemed to sift rather than shine. A faint mist clung to the river, drifting in lazy veils through the market square. Shopkeepers lifted their blinds with a weary kind of purpose. The sound of their rattling frames travelled through the narrow lanes like polite conversation overheard. In the window of Potts Tea Rooms, Mrs. Blenkiron presided as though over a tribunal. Her teacup clicked gently against its saucer each time she made a point, an effect that lent her pronouncements a kind of punctuation. "I tell you it moved on its own," she said, in a tone of settled authority. Miss Denby saw it with her very eyes. "Books do not simply crawl across tables, Mrs. Codd, unless helped by a presence." Across from her, Mrs. Codd, a woman whose disbelief was habitually softened by the sugar tongs, shook her head.
"Presence or prank?" she murmured. "It's unnerving."
"My Bernard said he won't step foot near those shelves till it's sorted." The bell over the door chimed as another customer entered. The conversation lowered, then resumed at once in fresh variations. By mid-morning, the library ghost had acquired new habits, new motives, even a vague biography. It had been seen as a shadow, then as a reflection. Finally, someone's niece swore it had whispered her name. Purbright heard all this in fragments as he made his way up High Street. He moved slowly as though the pace itself might draw out further details. Passing the bakery, he nodded to Miss Teal, who leaned from her doorway with the gleam of gossip already kindled. "They say it's old Mr. Lavery, Inspector," she called. "Come back for his pipe, no doubt," Purbright smiled. "I rather hope not. Tobacco duty's gone up dreadfully." He continued toward the police station, umbrella tapping lightly against the paving stones. A light fog lingered there, blurring the clock tower into a wavering silhouette. It seemed to fit the mood, Flaxborough adrift in its own speculation. Inside, Sergeant Malley was waiting with what he clearly considered fresh intelligence. "Seems the ghost's been active again, sir. A cleaner swears she heard a sigh from the basement last night." Purbright hung his hat neatly on the stand. "Ah, basements are particularly susceptible to sighs, Malley."
"Usually human ones, occasioned by dust." The sergeant grinned but pressed on.
"Mayor's had word of it too."
"Wants to know if we intend to investigate before the council meeting. Makes a mockery of it all." "Then we mustn't disappoint him," said Purbright mildly.
"A haunting, after all, is a delicate thing. Mishandled, it might vanish entirely. By afternoon, the inspector had indeed presented himself at the library, without fanfare, without warrant, but with the quiet assurance of someone merely exercising civic curiosity. The corridors were cool and faintly echoing. Even footsteps seemed to hesitate. Miss Denby greeted him with professional composure, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she locked away a stack of borrowers' cards. "Good afternoon, Inspector. I suppose you've heard. Rumours travel faster than overdue notices," said Purbright, setting his gloves upon the counter. "I hope you don't mind if I have a look about?" "Not at all, though there's nothing to see, really." "I find there rarely is," he said, as she led him through the aisles. The faint scent of leather bindings and furniture polish hung in the air, a scent both comforting and melancholy. The lamps flickered softly under their frosted shades, giving each row of shelves a subdued, sepulchral dignity. Purbright paused at the reference room door. "This is where the disturbance occurred?" Miss Denby hesitated before unlocking it. "Yes, the Oxford Companion was on that table. I had closed it myself an hour before." Inside, the air felt stiller, as though undisturbed since the night before. Dust motes drifted in the slanting light. Purbright bent to examine the polished surface of the table. His reflection looked back, slightly warped by the sheen. A faint line, perhaps from a dragged corner of a book, cut across the varnish. "Interesting," he murmured. "Do you believe in such things, Inspector?" "I believe," he said, "that most ghosts are less supernatural than emotional. hauntings of the living rather than the dead. She gave a faint smile, uncertain whether he jested.
I should like it to be that.
Less alarming. He straightened, glancing at the window latch, then at a small vent near the ceiling. May I ask, Miss Denby, whether anyone else possesses a key to this room? Only Margaret, my assistant, and myself, of course. We close it each evening. And yet, Purbright mused, something found its way in or out. She said nothing, merely folded her hands in that small, defensive manner librarians adopt when conversation strays beyond classification. A sound interrupted them, a faint rattle at the front counter. Margaret Hilliard's voice carried softly down the corridor. Miss Denby, someone's asking about the local history section. The senior librarian excused herself and departed, leaving Purbright alone in the half-lit room. He stood for a moment, listening. A clock somewhere above ticked with careful deliberation. He moved to the shelves, running a finger along the spines. Flaxborough through the ages, Market Town registers, 1821, 1905, diocese records. One volume was slightly ajar, its binding more worn than the rest. He drew it out. Inside the cover, an old borrower's card, yellowed, creased, bore a name. Arthur Lavery. The signature matched, in looping neatness, that of the late librarian whose supposed ghost now held the town in fascination. Purbright replaced the book, thoughtful. Perhaps grief lingered here, in paper and ink, more convincingly than any apparition could. When Miss Denby returned, he thanked her politely and made no mention of his find. Outside, dusk was already gathering, fog thickened in the square, wrapping lamplight into halos. Through the steamed windows of Potts' tea rooms, silhouettes leaned close over teacups, figures murmuring, gesturing, weaving the day's new version of the tale. As Purbright passed, he caught fragments through the glass. A candle flickered. She heard footsteps. The inspector's on the case. He smiled faintly to himself. The town, he thought, would not easily surrender its ghost. Served too many purposes: comfort, excitement, a sense that even in Flaxborough something unseen might stir beneath the routine. He paused on the pavement, listening to the muffled hum of conversation and the distant bell from St. Oswald's marking 6. The mist curled around him, cool and faintly scented with river salt. Whispers through windows, he murmured. And how willingly we listen. Then, turning up his collar, Inspector Purbright walked on toward the quiet evening, the ghost of the library following him, not in form but in thought. The following morning, Flaxborough lay beneath a stillness that seemed to hold its breath. Fog clung to the rooftops like old lace, muting every sound but the measured toll of the church bell drifting from St. Oswald's tower. Purbright arrived at the library just after 9, his umbrella tapping faintly at the step before he closed it and shook the damp from its ribs. Inside, warmth and quiet awaited him. The familiar scent of bindings, floor polish, and dusted velvet filled the air, a perfume of order, of lives carefully shelved. Behind the counter, Miss Denby was arranging new catalogues into a neat fan, her fingers betraying a small tremor when she noticed him. "Inspector Purbright," she said, in that careful tone reserved for authority and mild surprise. "How punctual of you." "Merely an admirer of civic punctuality," he replied, setting his hat upon the counter. "I thought I might trouble you for a few questions, though nothing alarming."
I assure you I'm not here to exercise anyone. Her mouth twitched at that, not quite a smile. If you'd care to sit, Inspector, I'll fetch Miss Hilliard. She was here during the incident, you'll recall. Please do, Purbright said.
Though I'd rather not disturb her work. Librarians are rarely improved by interrogation. He settled into a wooden chair near the reference desk where sunlight pooled in subdued rectangles across the carpet. From somewhere in the back, the faint sound of a trolley's wheels came, a rhythmic squeak, the slow cadence of shelving. It drew nearer until Margaret Hilliard appeared, a stack of returns in her arms. Her expression brightened upon seeing him, though it quickly rearranged itself into professional neutrality. "Good morning, Inspector." "Good morning, Miss Hilliard."
"I trust your ghost has behaved overnight." She laughed softly. "Perfectly. Though Miss Denby locked the reference room twice, just to be sure." Purbright inclined his head. "A wise precaution. Though in my experience, spirits are seldom deterred by Yale locks."
Her laughter, light and genuine, broke some of the room's tension. Miss Denby reappeared with a tray, tea for 3, the cups rattling faintly against the saucers. She poured with ceremonial care, eyes averted as if the act itself required reverence. "Do you mind," Purbright asked mildly, "if I take another look at the reference room later?" "Not at all," Miss Denby said. "Though I've already examined every shelf myself. Nothing's amiss." "Then I'm certain I'll find nothing either," Purbright said, sipping his tea. "Still, I find a second look occasionally reveals less tangible things, temperaments, for instance." Margaret glanced toward her superior, then quickly down at her cup. The movement did not escape him. He leaned back, speaking with the quiet ease of a man in no hurry. "You've worked together long?" "4 years," Miss Denby replied before the girl could. "Margaret came to us after finishing her clerical course at the Technical College." "And enjoys the work?" "Very much," Margaret said quickly, meeting his gaze for the first time. "Though we've fewer readers these days. Most borrow romances and detective novels. Hardly anyone touches the reference section now." "Except ghosts," murmured Purbright, and her smile returned, fleeting but sincere. He set his cup down, the porcelain giving a crisp click. "Tell me, Miss Denby, did Mr. Lavery, your predecessor, keep many personal effects here?" Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "A few. He was devoted to this place, spent his evenings cataloguing donations long after hours. His
"Successor hasn't adopted that custom?" "Certainly not," she said too quickly.
The regulations forbid it now. Insurance matters." Purbright nodded as though convinced. "I see. One mustn't risk haunting by bureaucracy." From the far shelves came the sound of someone coughing, a patron half buried among the biographies. The noise seemed to punctuate the silence that followed. When Margaret rose to return her trolley, Miss Denby's gaze followed her, steady, supervisory, yet faintly strained. Purbright observed it without appearing to do so. He recognized that look, half concern, half possessiveness. There were ghosts here indeed, of authority, habit, and the quiet tyranny of routine. He stood. "Might I have that look in the reference room now?" Miss Denby fetched the keys with reluctant precision. The lock turned smoothly, its click echoing faintly in the hush. The room was as before, orderly, immaculate, faintly melancholy in the filtered light. "Nothing has been moved," she said. Purbright crossed to the table, fingertips brushing the polished edge. He opened the Oxford Companion to the same page she had mentioned, though the entry itself was unremarkable, lamentation term used to describe a poetic expression of mourning. He read the first line quietly aloud as if tasting it. "Appropriate perhaps for the mood of the town." Miss Denby frowned faintly. "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing," said Purbright. "Merely musing. You're certain no one enters after hours?" "I am." "And yet you remain uneasy." Her composure faltered. "It's not the thing itself, Inspector, it's the talk. This sort of nonsense cheapens the library. People laugh. People will always laugh, Purbright said gently. Sometimes to hide curiosity, sometimes fear. The remedy is patience. He walked to the window, studying its latch, then the narrow vent above it. The faintest draught brushed his wrist, no more than the whisper of cold air against warm glass. When he turned, Margaret was standing in the doorway, hesitant. "Miss Denby, the courier's here for the interlibrary parcels." Her superior's voice snapped a fraction sharper than necessary. "Then sign for them, please." The girl withdrew, closing the door softly. Silence fell again, layered and fragile. Purbright said, "You care for her?" Miss Denby's brow tightened. "She's a capable assistant." "Of course, but it's more than that. You wish to protect her from ridicule, perhaps, or from curiosity not her own." She turned away, pretending to straighten a stack of journals.
"I'm sure I don't know what you mean." He watched her for a moment longer, then nodded, satisfied. "Forgive me. Occupational hazard. I see mysteries where there may be none." She faced him again, the faintest tremor in her hands.
"There is no mystery, Inspector, only foolish gossip and nerves." "Quite so," he said, adjusting his gloves. "Still, if ghosts exist anywhere, I should think they'd prefer libraries. All that silence to listen to and all those words to hide behind." At the doorway, he paused, his voice almost companionable. "If you think of anything, however slight, do let me know. Flaxborough's peace depends upon its librarians as much as its policemen." She inclined her head in agreement. Outside, the fog had thinned to a silvery film. Purbright stood for a moment beneath the lintel, drawing in the cool air, the faint tang of damp stone and distant coal smoke. The town stirred gently around him, footsteps on cobbles, a cart rattling somewhere unseen. He set off toward the station, thoughtful. In his mind, the pieces moved quietly. A locked room, a cautious woman, a younger one watched too closely, and a dead man whose name lingered between their silences like the scent of old tobacco. A haunting, perhaps. But not, he suspected, of the supernatural kind. By the week's end, the ghost of the Flaxborough Library had been both explained and improved upon by half the population. What began as a whisper had become, through the town's industrious retelling, a phenomenon so domesticated it might almost have paid rates. At the Green Man public house, Mr. Fentiman the tailor declared with solemn certainty that it was no more than a draught from the west window. He illustrated this by blowing across his pint to show how easily a puff of air might shift a loose page. This convinced no one, but pleased him greatly. At the hairdresser's, meanwhile, Mrs. Chubb, who had been told by a cousin's neighbour's son that animals were sometimes kept by night watchmen, had settled upon a cat. "A grey one," she added, "because grey cats have that ghostly way of looking through you." The theory travelled swiftly, shedding its origin and acquiring conviction by repetition. By afternoon, even the mayor's secretary was heard to remark that the cat had been a long-haired Persian belonging to a Mr. Lavery. In the cafe window, Mrs. Blenkiron presided again, this time with the air of an expert witness. "If you ask me," she said, "it's all that new heating system. Steam and spirits, that's what I call it. Unhappy mixture." To this the Reverend Snipe, who had wandered in to order seed cake and stay for gossip, offered a mild theological adjustment. "You'll find," he said, buttering his slice, "that old buildings remember their sins. That library was a rectory once, back in 1840. There were rumours, unfortunate happenings. Energies, perhaps, that never quite dispersed." His listeners nodded solemnly. No one knew what energies meant, but it sounded both scientific and grave. Inspector Purbright, encountering this web of speculation on his way to the station, received each version with the same mild courtesy. He neither endorsed nor contradicted, only inclined his head, as though all were equally probable in a world so fond of stories. "Do you believe in energies, sir?" Sergeant Malley asked, not entirely without hope. Purbright looked up from a file, considering. "I believe in motives, Malley. They tend to generate more heat." The sergeant grinned, though his expression faltered as Purbright added, "and in drafts, of another kind entirely, the sort one finds in letters." Late that afternoon, Purbright returned once more to the library. The air inside was warm and dry. Faint motes swam lazily in the sunbeams that angled through the high windows. The murmur of turning pages came from two students at the far end. Miss Denby, immaculate as ever, looked up from her desk with restrained composure. "Inspector," she said, "I hope you're not here to measure temperatures." "Not at all," he said pleasantly. "I've come to test a theory. Several, in fact." Her eyebrow lifted, half wary, half amused.
"Then you'll find plenty."
"The town has supplied enough to fill an appendix, I've heard," he said. "Ghosts, cats, drafts, and one suggestion involving radiators and sin. It's impressive what ingenuity idleness can inspire." She allowed herself a brief smile.
"And your own view?"
"That no haunting survives long without an audience," Purbright said. "And that this one has already outstayed its welcome." He strolled toward the reference room. The door stood open now, perhaps in quiet defiance of fear. He paused at the threshold. The room looked smaller in daylight, less spectral, more scholarly. On the wall hung an old framed photograph, the library staff of some decades past. Mr. Lavery's likeness was there, neat, moustached, faintly melancholy. Miss Denby, noticing his attention, spoke softly behind him. He gave that photograph to the counsel himself. Said he wanted the library to remember its servants. "A touching sentiment," said Purbright. "Do you think it was returned?" She frowned. "Returned?" "In kind," he said. "Memory, after all, is a two-way process." He moved to the table where the Oxford Companion still rested. Someone, Margaret perhaps, had replaced it neatly in its accustomed position. The faint scratch in the varnish glimmered like a scar. "Do you suppose," he asked idly, "that Mr. Lavery ever made enemies here?"
"Enemies?"
Her tone sharpened. "Certainly not. He was a devoted man. To the library? To everything it stood for." Purbright turned to face her. "Then perhaps that devotion lingers in less convenient ways."
"Not as a haunting, you understand, merely as an obligation felt too strongly by the living." Her gaze wavered, the smallest crack in composure. "I don't see what you mean." "No, perhaps not," he said gently.
"But I rather think Miss Hilliard might." At the sound of her name, Margaret appeared from between the shelves, a volume of county records in her arms. Her face, normally bright, seemed tense, as though she'd overheard more than intended. "You wanted something, Inspector?"
"Only conversation," Purbright said kindly.
"The town's quite content to solve our mystery without assistance. They've appointed a cat and an unfortunate breeze as the culprits."
"I wonder, should we let them?"
Margaret hesitated. "If it stops the gossip, perhaps we should." "Perhaps," he echoed. "Though truth, Miss Hilliard, has a habit of persisting even when no one asks for it." She said nothing. The silence thickened again, filled with the soft ticking of the library clock and the faint hiss of the radiator. Through the windows came the muffled cry of a milkman's whistle, strangely distant. Purbright looked from one woman to the other, his expression mild, speculative. "Well," he said at last, "I think we can safely discount spectres, felines, and vengeful clergy. That should leave us with something far more plausible and far more human." Miss Denby's teacup rattled faintly against its saucer. "I hope you're not implying—" "Implying nothing," he interrupted gently, "merely observing. Libraries, Miss Denby, are full of unfinished business. The past has a way of leaving its cards unreturned." He placed his hat upon his head and smiled in that courteous, unreadable manner that unsettled and reassured in equal measure. "Good day to you both." The bell above the door gave a soft jingle as he departed. Outside, the fog had lifted entirely, revealing a sky of dull pewter and the faint gleam of wet cobbles. The library behind him looked peaceful, respectable, and entirely innocent, like a witness rehearsing its silence. Purbright paused at the corner, lighting his pipe. The smoke drifted upward, mingling with the chill air. "A neat explanation," he murmured to himself, watching it fade. Neatness, alas, is seldom the same as truth. That evening, as the clock at the police station tolled 6, a faint drizzle began again, thin, steady, and unhurried. Purbright, alone in his office, had opened the window an inch to let in the scent of wet stone and the faint hum of passing tires. On his desk lay the latest stack of reports, routine matters of petty theft and misplaced bicycles, all precise and comfortingly dull. Yet his thoughts, like the smoke curling from his pipe, drifted elsewhere, to the quiet corridors of the library, to the expressions that had flickered between Miss Denby and her assistant. He drew the pipe from his mouth and exhaled thoughtfully. Something had been missing from their answers. Not falsehood exactly, more the deliberate omission of a word neither wished to say. His eye fell upon a small envelope at the corner of his blotter. Mally had left it earlier. A bundle of items gathered by the constable who handled lost property. A button, 2 handkerchiefs, and he smiled, a borrower's card. It bore the embossed crest of the Flaxborough Library, the ink faintly smudged by damp. The name written across it in blue fountain pen read, Arthur Lavery. Purbright turned it over, examining the corners. It was old, worn, but not so much as to belong to a man 5 years dead. On the reverse, someone had penciled a date, October 14. The handwriting, neat, feminine, was unmistakably modern. He rose, replaced his coat, and set out once more into the evening. Flaxborough after dark carried its own hush, a mix of hearth smoke, rain on gutters, and the slow roll of wheels along High Street. The lamps, haloed with moisture, trembled slightly in the mist. By the time Purbright reached the library, the last patrons were leaving. He caught sight of Margaret fastening her coat, while Miss Denby drew the blinds with habitual precision. "Forgive the intrusion," Purbright said as he stepped inside, "but something has come into my possession that may belong to you." Miss Denby looked up sharply, though her tone remained polite.
"To the library?"
"To one of its ghosts, perhaps." He held out the card. "Found among the lost property this afternoon." Margaret leaned forward before her superior could speak.
"But where was it?"
"According to the constable, in a bin behind the post office."
"Odd, don't you think, for a ghost to correspond by mail?"
The girl's brow furrowed.
"That's Mr. Lavery's card, surely."
"I've seen his signature in the archives." "Yes," Purbright said softly. "So have I. And in another place entirely." Miss Denby took the card from his hand, holding it delicately as though it might crumble. The faintest scent rose from it, sweet, nostalgic, unmistakable. "Pipe tobacco," Purbright murmured. "The old-fashioned sort. Cherry blend, perhaps?" Miss Denby's fingers tightened slightly.
"He used to smoke it," she said after a pause.
"Before it was banned from the reading rooms. The smell lingered for months." "Indeed," said Purbright. "And yet this card, which cannot have lain untouched for 5 years, still carries it." The silence between them stretched thin. Margaret glanced uncertainly toward the senior librarian. "I think," said Purbright, "there may be something of interest in your records. May I?" Miss Denby hesitated, then fetched a key from her desk drawer. "The old borrower ledgers are kept downstairs. They're hardly relevant now. Everything's on file cards." "I've found irrelevance to be remarkably informative," he said pleasantly. The basement smelled of damp paper and paraffin polish. The overhead light flickered to life with a faint buzz, revealing shelves lined with ledgers bound in faded green cloth. Purbright trailed his gloved fingers along the spines until Miss Denby selected one, marked 1958 to 1965. She set it upon a central table, its cover creaking faintly. He opened it near the end. The pages were yellowed, the ink gone brown with age, but the columns of names remained clear.
"Here we are," he murmured.
Arthur Lavery, regular borrower until October 5 years ago. A final entry. Collected donation of rare editions. Signed beneath, in that same confident hand. He examined the signature closely. The capital L swept high and dipped low, the final Y curling in an elegant loop. He took the lost card from his pocket and compared them side by side. The loops matched perfectly, but the pressure differed. One firm, one trembling. He looked up. Who last handled this ledger? Miss Denby's answer came after a heartbeat. I did. We were rearranging the archives last month.
Margaret assisted me. The girl nodded, her expression open, but her eyes avoided the inspector's. And during that rearrangement, Purbright continued, you found this page again, perhaps. Read the name, remembered the scent. Old memories can be surprisingly physical. Margaret's voice came softly.
It was Miss Denby who noticed it. She said we should dust the covers properly, so I fetched polish from the cupboard. The older woman's tone, though calm, had cooled. Inspector, if this is meant to be an interrogation, merely curiosity, he said lightly. A professional ailment. Though I admit it interests me that Mr. Lavery's name continues to surface in tangible ways. His card, his handwriting, even his tobacco.
As if the past were being quietly restored piece by piece. Her lips parted, but no reply came.
The hum of the light filled the silence, steady and faintly oppressive. Purbright closed the ledger gently.
You see, Miss Denby, I've always thought ghosts don't appear to frighten us, but to remind us, usually of what we've hidden. She gave a short, brittle laugh.
You give the dead too much credit, Inspector. Perhaps. Or perhaps not enough to the living. He turned toward the stair, then paused. Would you happen to know, by the way, who keeps the spare key to the reference room? She drew herself up. Only the original was lost some months ago. Ah, Purbright said quietly. Then perhaps it too has chosen to reappear. He left them standing in the half-lit basement, the air thick with the mingled scent of dust and something sweeter, fainter now, but undeniably there. Outside, the drizzle had become a fine mist, turning every lamplight into a halo. Purbright walked slowly, his thoughts unhurried but alert. The card, the scent, the signature, all small things, yet together they formed a thread. And threads, he knew, had a way of leading precisely where one least wished to go. At the corner of the square, he paused beneath the gas lamp and examined the card once more under its pale glow. The ink shimmered slightly as if still drying. He smiled faintly, pocketed it again, and murmured to himself, Mr. Lavery, it seems your library ticket is still in circulation. Then, turning up his collar against the fine rain, Inspector Purbright walked on into the soft hiss of the night, following that invisible thread toward whatever hand had tugged it first. The following morning, Flaxborough resumed its calm exterior, though beneath the drizzle-polished streets and chiming shop doors there was, as Purbright knew, the faint creak of movement, small wheels turning behind polite faces. He found himself once more in the town hall, a building that smelt faintly of linseed oil and unspoken objections. Councillor Hargreaves, chairman of the library subcommittee, received him with a guarded cordiality. Inspector, said Hargreaves, gesturing toward a chair. If this is about that ghost nonsense, I assure you the matter has already been dealt with. We've instructed the staff to refrain from gossip. Purbright smiled, settling himself. Then you've performed a small miracle, Councillor. I've yet to meet a Flaxborough resident capable of refraining from gossip without medical intervention. Hargreaves chuckled uncertainly. Quite. Still no harm done, eh? A little excitement for the townsfolk. No harm yet? Purbright said mildly. Though I understand there was once a more material disturbance, a donation that never found its way to the shelves. The councillor's smile faded. Ah, that business. Ancient history, Inspector. A collection of rare books, Edwardian bindings, all of them.
Lavery was to catalogue them before his retirement. He died rather suddenly, and the donation—
Well, it seems to have been mislaid. Mislaid, Purbright repeated, as if weighing the word.
Not stolen?
Good heavens, no. Nothing of value to anyone but a bibliophile. The donor, a Mr. Cotterill, moved away before the inventory was finished. We assume the matter closed. And yet, Purbright said, 5 years on, his name still appears in council minutes. Budgetary debates, allocations, and the occasional letter of complaint. Hargreaves coughed discreetly. A tedious man. One of those who believes a library should smell of parchment and candle wax. Objected to electric lighting, if you please. Purbright smiled faintly. The past, it seems, objects to illumination in general. From the corridor came the faint echo of a typewriter, each keystroke distinct as falling rain. Somewhere beyond, a clock struck 11. Purbright rose. "You've been very helpful, Councillor. Might I trouble you for access to those minutes? I promise to handle them less roughly than the electorate." "Certainly," Hargreaves said, though his expression suggested misgivings. "They're in the clerk's office."
"Ask for Miss Harby. Formidable woman, but she likes policemen." "An endearing eccentricity," Purbright murmured. He left the town hall with a folder of papers tucked beneath his arm.
Pausing on the steps to watch the street, the drizzle had lifted, leaving pavements dark and gleaming. Across the square, the library's tall windows caught the faintest reflection of clouded sky. A delivery cart trundled past, its wheels whispering over the cobbles, followed by the murmur of 2 schoolboys speculating in breathless tones about the ghost that reads Shakespeare. Purbright crossed to the station, where Sergeant Malley awaited him with his usual look of cautious expectation. "Found something, sir?" "Several somethings," Purbright said, removing his gloves. "A missing donation, an overzealous counsel, and a librarian whose conscience appears to have excellent handwriting." Malley blinked. "You think Miss Denby—" "I think," said Purbright, "that Flaxborough's ghosts wear very human shoes." He opened the folder on his desk. The council minutes, typed in neat columns, listed motions for lamppost replacements, roof repairs, and near the bottom of one page, disposition of Cotterill collection, pending verification by librarian Lavery. Beneath that, a handwritten note, transferred to temporary custody. A.D. Purbright tapped the initials lightly with one finger. "Miss Denby's work, I think," Malley frowned. "Custody where, sir?" "That," said Purbright, "is precisely what I mean to discover." By afternoon he was again at the library. The reading room was nearly empty, only one elderly gentleman dozing over a newspaper and a student copying notes with devotional intensity. Miss Denby was at the counter, conferring with a man in a grey mackintosh whose tone carried the faint authority of civic office. As Purbright entered, the man gave a curt nod and departed. "Inspector," Miss Denby said, recovering her composure, "Councillor Hargreaves mentioned you might be inquiring further."
"I do hope you're not planning to turn our stacks upside down." "Not without reason," Purbright said, resting his hat on the counter.
"Though it's possible the ghost may have done so already." Her smile was thin. "Our shelves are in perfect order, I've no doubt," he said. "But sometimes disorder hides behind precision. It has the neatest disguise of all." He handed her a sheet from the folder. "You wrote this note, I think. Temporary custody. Where were the Cotterill volumes stored?" For a moment she stared at the paper, then said quietly, "In the West Annex." It was Mr. Lavery's suggestion. The books were fragile, and he wanted to restore their bindings before they went on display. And after his death, they remained there.
"I saw no reason to move them. May I see them now?"
She hesitated, then reached for her keys. "If you wish. But there's little to see. Dust, mostly." The annex was a narrow chamber beyond the main stacks, accessible through a low-arched door. The air inside was cool, heavy with the scent of leather and mildew. A single electric bulb flickered weakly overhead. Along one wall stood a wooden cabinet, its glass panes clouded with age. Miss Denby unlocked it and stepped aside. Purbright bent to examine the shelves. Half a dozen volumes stood upright, their spines gilded, their titles faded, essays of Lamb, the English poets, Horace in translation. On the lower shelf, however, an uneven gap revealed where others had once stood. "Not a full collection," Purbright murmured.
How many were there originally?
23, she said.
18 remain, and the missing 5.
Destroyed, perhaps. Water damage years ago? Perhaps, Purbright echoed. He drew one volume from the shelf, opening it carefully. On the inside cover was a bookplate from the Library of Arthur Lavery. Below, in faint pencil, a name and date written by another hand, A.D., March 1963. He closed the book slowly. "You catalogued them personally?"
Yes. Mr. Lavery insisted that I continue the work. It was
"Something of a promise." "A promise," Purbright repeated softly. "One you've kept rather faithfully, I think." Her chin lifted.
I take pride in the library's integrity, Inspector. Indeed, he said.
Though sometimes integrity becomes indistinguishable from guilt, particularly when one guards what no longer belongs to them. Her breath caught, but she said nothing. He replaced the book, brushed the dust from his sleeve, and turned toward the door. As they stepped back into the main room, Margaret approached, her cheeks flushed, from the cold storeroom beyond. "Miss Denby, the council clerk's been asking for those circulation figures again."
I said you'd send them tomorrow. That will do, Margaret, Miss Denby said quickly. Purbright nodded to the girl.
"Efficient as ever. You must be quite indispensable," Margaret smiled faintly. "Miss Denby runs everything."
I only follow her system. Yes, said Purbright.
"Systems are like ghosts. They persist long after their creators are gone." As he left the library, the rain began once more, pattering softly against his umbrella. Behind him, through the steamed glass, he could just make out the figures of the two women, one standing rigid behind the counter, the other speaking in low tones, uncertain.
Anxious. He walked slowly across the square.
The papers under his arm growing damp at the corners. The town lay quiet, respectable, its secrets folded neatly between ledger lines and library shelves. Yet beneath that composure, Purbright could feel the faint tug of connection. Mr. Lavery's name, the missing books, the ghostly scent of tobacco, all threads in a tapestry woven by loneliness and loyalty. He stopped beneath a street lamp, listening to the rain on the cobbles. Somewhere in the distance a train whistle blew, long and low. "The town unfolds," he murmured, "though only as much as it dares." By nightfall the rain had thinned to a faint mist, curling like breath along the eaves. The library stood alone in the square, its tall windows dimly aglow, a solitary lantern among shuttered shops. It was closing hour, yet a single light remained burning in the reading room, a glow that trembled as though uncertain of itself. From the shadows beneath the elm opposite, Purbright waited, his coat collar turned up against the damp. He watched the building with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to silence. The square lay hushed, but not empty. The faint tick of a cooling lamp-post, the rustle of leaves slick with moisture, the distant stroke of the church clock marking 9. The librarian's silhouette appeared briefly, Miss Denby, unmistakably, locking the side door. The beam of her torch swept across the pavement, caught the rain, and vanished. Moments later the main lights inside went out. Only that single lamp in the reading room remained. Purbright drew his watch from his pocket, a little past 9:15. The faint reflection of the lamp shimmered against the wet glass. Then movement, slight but definite. A figure crossing the reading room, pausing by the long table, bending to examine something unseen. A woman, by the shape of her shoulders. Not Miss Denby, this one moved with a quicker, less measured step. He waited until the shadows stilled. Then quietly he crossed the square. His shoes made no sound on the slick cobbles. He stopped just short of the window, the glow from inside dimly illuminating the raindrops on the pane. The figure was there still, Margaret Hilliard. She stood near the reference shelves, one hand resting on the table where the Oxford Companion usually lay. Purbright watched as she opened a small drawer in the side cabinet. Her face, half turned toward the lamp, showed neither fear nor guilt, but something gentler. Sadness, perhaps, or reverence. From the drawer she drew a small tobacco pouch, worn and frayed. She lifted it to her face, breathed in the scent, and then, very carefully, set it back inside. The inspector remained motionless, the scene before him as quiet and unguarded as a prayer. After a moment she reached for a sheet of paper, unfolded it, and read. Her lips moved silently, tracing words the rain could not hear. When she finished, she folded the paper again, slipped it into her pocket, and turned off the lamp. The room sank into darkness. Purbright stepped back, blending once more into the fog. He waited another 5 minutes, then followed as she emerged from the side door, locking it behind her. She walked swiftly along the square, her footsteps small and purposeful. Purbright kept to the opposite pavement, a respectful distance behind. At the corner, she turned down Church Lane and disappeared into the narrow row of terraced houses where lamplight pooled in shallow puddles. When her door closed, he lingered briefly, then made his way back to the library. The rain had almost ceased. The air held that faint metallic scent of wet stone cooling under night. He approached the window once more. Inside, the room was completely dark. Yet the lock on the side door glistened slightly, as if freshly handled. He withdrew a small torch from his pocket, shielded the light with his hand, and knelt. The doorframe bore a fine scratch near the lock plate.
Recent, by the look of it.
Someone had been entering without a key, or with one remade. The sound of distant footsteps made him extinguish the beam. He straightened, blending again with the shadows, and waited. A moment later, Miss Denby's figure appeared at the far end of the street, umbrella aloft, returning toward the library. She paused at the door, unlocked it, and went inside. Her movements were brisk, mechanical, as though she performed the task nightly. Within moments, the reading room light glowed again. Purbright watched her cross to the same cabinet Margaret had opened minutes before. She pulled the drawer fully out this time and examined its contents. A flicker of recognition, or perhaps of irritation, crossed her face. Then she replaced the drawer, switched off the lamp, and left once more, locking the door with measured care. The inspector's breath fogged faintly in the chill. The pattern had emerged. 2 women, 1 room, and a ritual of secrecy played out under lamplight.
No haunting, merely habit disguised by fear. He turned back toward the station, his thoughts keeping pace with the rain-slick rhythm of his steps.
Flaxborough's ghosts, he mused, were loyal creatures. They lingered not for vengeance, but for companionship, for the faint warmth of memory that refused to die properly. Inside the police station, the gas fire burned low. Mally looked up from a crossword. "Nothing stirring, sir?"
"Oh, quite the opposite," Purbright said, removing his coat.
"Plenty stirring, only too gently to raise alarms." Was it the ghost again? Purbright smiled faintly. A ghost of sorts, though more affectionate than malicious. You might say it still writes letters to the living. Mally frowned, but the inspector's tone discouraged questions. He stood at the window, watching the lamplight tremble on the wet street outside. "She's been visiting after hours," he said quietly, more to himself than to the sergeant. "Reading something that belonged to him.
A letter, perhaps. A scent preserved in cloth.
Nothing criminal, yet everything concealed." Mally shut his crossword. "What'll you do, sir?" "Wait," said Purbright. "The living, like ghosts, always return to the same place eventually. We're drawn to our unfinished sentences." He turned from the window, pipe in hand, and added softly, "And tonight, I think, the light has begun to change." The following morning broke thin and colourless, a washed-out light spreading across Flaxborough as if the sky itself were reluctant to commit. The drizzle had ended, leaving pavements slick and shining like pewter. In his office, Purbright sat at his desk, steam rising from his tea, and allowed his thoughts to settle into their customary order. There was, he reflected, a curious decency to deceit, not the grand sort that ruined fortunes, but the small, domestic variety, the kind nurtured by affection or pride. In Flaxborough, deception rarely came from malice. More often, it grew from longing, or the fear that truth might prove too ordinary to be worth the telling. He tamped his pipe, struck a match, and watched the smoke curl in slow blue ribbons. Two women, bound by a name no longer spoken, a handful of missing books, a ghost no one truly wished to disprove. And at the heart of it all, that delicate scent of pipe tobacco, a remnant of comfort clinging stubbornly to the present. He reached for the telephone, dialed the library, and waited. After a moment, Miss Denby's crisp voice answered. "Good morning, Miss Denby. Inspector Purbright here. I wonder if I might impose on you once more this afternoon, purely in the interests of tidiness." There was the faintest pause before she replied. "Of course, Inspector.
At what time?"
3 o'clock, if that suits. I should like to return a manuscript found among our lost property. It may belong to one of your readers, I see."
"Yes, that will be fine." "Excellent," said Purbright.
"And do tell Miss Hilliard to remain, if you would. She may recall who borrowed it." He replaced the receiver gently. The manuscript in question did not, in fact, exist. But the idea of it, something valuable yet harmless, easily misplaced, easily claimed, had its uses. By 3 the clouds had gathered once more, pressing low and heavy above the square. Purbright entered the library with a file envelope beneath his arm, his umbrella glistening faintly from the mist. The hall smelled of paper and polish and that faint, lingering sweetness he had come to expect. Miss Denby greeted him at the counter. Behind her, Margaret arranged a small display of local histories, her movements careful, almost ceremonious. "Inspector," said Miss Denby, "you've brought the manuscript."
"Indeed." He set the envelope down between them. Found on a bench near the river.
"No name inside, though the handwriting is distinctive. Perhaps you'll recognize it." She glanced at it, but made no move to open it.
"I can't say that I do." "Curious," Purbright murmured.
"It's a fair copy of a memoir by the look of it, dated some years ago. Quite sentimental." Margaret's head turned slightly, interest flickering across her face. "May I see it?" "Certainly," said Purbright, and slid the envelope toward her. She hesitated, glancing at Miss Denby. The older woman's nod was minute but permissive. Margaret drew out the folded pages. The top sheet bore a title written in firm, elegant strokes, "The Flaxborough Years, Notes by a Country Librarian." Beneath, a name, Arthur Lavery. Her breath caught audibly.
"It's his writing," she whispered. "Is it indeed?"
said Purbright softly. "How fortunate." "I'd hate to mislay another ghost." Miss Denby's colour had drained to a fine porcelain pallor.
"This must be a copy," she said.
"The original was never completed." "Ah," Purbright replied. "Then perhaps it was finished after all. By another hand, maybe." Silence stretched between them, filled by the slow tick of the library clock. Purbright watched them both, the girl's open, troubled astonishment, the woman's effort to contain something fragile within her composure. He took the envelope back, slipped it shut again, and smiled pleasantly. "It may belong to neither of you, of course. Perhaps someone found the notes and recopied them. I shall leave it here until claimed." "Very well," said Miss Denby, her voice scarcely above a whisper. "Meanwhile," he continued, "I should hate to think the business has caused unpleasantness between you. Flaxborough thrives on calm."
"One might say it's our chief export." Margaret smiled faintly at that.
Miss Denby did not. Purbright inclined his head. "Before I go, might I trouble you for something restorative? A cup of cocoa, perhaps?"
"I've been told librarians make the finest in the county." That earned a proper smile from Margaret. I'll fetch some from the staff room. When she had gone, the inspector leaned a little closer to Miss Denby. You needn't worry, he said quietly.
The manuscript contains no scandal, only gratitude, affection, and a certain sadness. A man taking stock of his life's small decencies. It's rather touching, her eyes lifted to meet his.
Then you've read it?
I wrote it, said Purbright, just as softly. Well, most of it. A few familiar phrases, a borrowed hand.
Enough to test an impulse. The pause that followed was not of outrage, but recognition.
She exhaled slowly. And what have you proved, Inspector? That affection can be honest without being possessive, he said. That memory, if forced to hide, grows into guilt. And that the past, when treated gently, asks only to be acknowledged, not embalmed. Margaret returned then, carrying a tray, 3 cups of cocoa, the steam rising in faint spirals. She set it down with a small smile.
I made enough for everyone. Most considerate, said Purbright.
He took a sip, nodding approval. You see, Miss Denby, warmth returns easily to places that have been too long cold. Margaret looked from one to the other, puzzled by the undercurrent she could sense, but not name.
You'll keep the manuscript, then?
For now, said Purbright. But I rather think it belongs here, perhaps in your archives, under a less ghostly heading. Miss Denby's fingers tightened around her cup.
You mean to expose us? He shook his head.
No, merely to restore order. Ghosts are notoriously poor librarians. They never return what they borrow. Her composure faltered. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady. He meant a great deal to me, Inspector.
I couldn't bear to let him fade. Margaret didn't understand. I think she does now, said Purbright gently. Margaret's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with sudden clarity.
I only wanted to remember him too. You never spoke of him, and I thought, perhaps you disapproved. Miss Denby looked at her then properly, for the first time. A long silence passed between them, an exchange more honest than words. Purbright rose, setting his cup down.
Oh well, he said lightly, I see no crime here, only loyalty misplaced by loneliness. As he reached the door, he paused.
Keep the manuscript.
It may do the library some good to have a ghost properly catalogued at last. Outside, the mist was thick again, softening the edges of the square.
Behind him, faint through the glass, came the sound of quiet conversation and the gentle clink of cups. Purbright walked slowly toward the station, his hands clasped behind his back, the smell of cocoa and old paper lingering faintly on his coat. Flaxborough, he thought, was full of hauntings, none spectral, all human. And though the town would soon forget the library ghost, it would not forget the warmth that followed its unmasking. He smiled to himself, a small, private thing. Order, after all, had been restored, though not quite the kind one could file by number. Rain began again at midday, soft and unhurried, drawing faint silver lines across the library windows. Inside, the lamps burned low, their glow gentle as candlelight. The reading room felt warmer than usual, perhaps from the weather, or from the lingering stillness after the morning's quiet reconciliation. Books lay open on desks like small, obedient witnesses. Purbright arrived without ceremony. He left his umbrella by the radiator, brushed the rain from his coat, and moved with his usual calm toward the counter. Miss Denby was there, her expression unreadable but no longer brittle. Margaret sat nearby, sorting borrower cards into tidy stacks, the rhythm of her work soothing and unforced. "Inspector," Miss Denby said, her tone polite but lighter now. "You find us peaceful at last?" "Peaceful," Purbright replied, removing his hat, "is often mistaken for dullness. I've yet to decide which is the greater virtue." He smiled faintly and looked around. The library breathed again. The tension had thinned, though not entirely vanished. It hovered like the faint scent of rain-damp wool. "I've come," he said after a pause, "to return something properly." He placed a small parcel on the counter, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "The manuscript."
"I've made my notes and corrections, though not to the prose."
That belongs to another hand entirely. Margaret stopped sorting.
You've read it?
Enough to understand, said Purbright. It wasn't a ghost you were chasing, Miss Hilliard. Nor one haunting you, Miss Denby. Only a man who left too quietly and a memory you both tried, each in your way, to keep alive. Neither woman spoke.
Outside, the rain deepened, a soft percussion on the windows.
In the silence, the library's clock gave a measured tick. Purbright untied the string and unfolded the wrapping. The pages lay there, clean and orderly, the ink faded but firm. He touched the first page lightly with one finger. Arthur Lavery's handwriting, yes, but not his alone. See here, these lines in a finer pen, added later. Miss Denby's additions. A cataloguer's hand, neat and reverent. Not invention, preservation. She looked down at the pages, voice barely above a whisper. He left it unfinished.
A few notes, a draft. I only...
Completed what he might have wished to say. Purbright nodded. A modest resurrection. And the pipe tobacco, the book that moved by itself, those were merely echoes, small rituals to keep him present. You were never trying to deceive, only to remember. Margaret's hands had gone still.
And I thought it was wrong, she said softly. I thought she was hiding something dreadful.
I'm sorry. Miss Denby reached for the girl's hand, hesitated, then took it.
No, she said quietly.
You were right to question me. Grief grows selfish when left unchallenged. Purbright regarded them with the faint melancholy of one who has seen the pattern before. Different faces, same yearning. It isn't deception that troubles me, he said. It's the town's eagerness to believe in spectres, so ready to dress loneliness in white sheets, so unwilling to call it by its proper name. He began rewrapping the manuscript with care. Flaxborough's ghosts, you see, are not the dead, but the living who can't quite bring themselves to let go. A kettle clicked faintly from the staff room beyond. Margaret rose to fetch it, and soon returned with a tray, 3 cups, the scent of strong tea mingling with the rain. She poured without a word. When she handed Purbright his, he inclined his head in thanks. An excellent brew, he said, lifting it. I sometimes think tea is England's most reliable form of absolution. Miss Denby smiled for the first time that day. Genuine, weary, but real. Then perhaps we're forgiven, Inspector. I've no doubt, he replied. You've done less harm in your haunting than most do in their living. For a while, they drank in companionable quiet.
Outside, the rain slackened, turning to a fine whisper.
Through the misted glass, the square blurred into soft greys, the lamp-posts hazy as lanterns under water. After some minutes, Purbright set down his cup. What will you do now? Catalogue the manuscript properly, said Miss Denby. File it under local history, I think. That's what Arthur would have wanted. And perhaps add a note, Purbright suggested, explaining that ghosts are best consulted through reading, not apparition. Margaret laughed gently.
I'll see to it myself, he rose, slipping on his coat.
Then I'll leave you both to your work. Flaxborough may grow restless if its hauntings are resolved too quickly. Someone will be obliged to invent another by next week. Miss Denby tilted her head. And you'll come to investigate, of course. Only if it involves teacups and reason, he said, reaching for his umbrella. Spectres of either variety I can tolerate. He paused at the doorway, glancing back once more. The 2 women had already resumed their quiet tasks, Margaret filing, Miss Denby smoothing the manuscript's edges with almost maternal care. The lamplight softened their faces, made them seem part of the same gentle composition, a portrait of reconciliation, framed in stillness. Purbright stepped outside. The air smelled of rain and wet pavement, tinged faintly with coal smoke from some distant hearth. He stood for a moment under the eaves, then walked slowly across the square, his shoes clicking softly in the puddles. Behind him, the library's windows glowed like watchful eyes. He paused at the far curb, looked back once, and lifted his umbrella.
No ghost after all, he murmured.
Only gratitude in disguise. The rain fell lighter now, almost playful, against the fabric. As he turned the corner toward the police station, a church bell tolled the half-hour, each note dissolving into the damp air. Somewhere, a shopkeeper drew down his blinds. Somewhere else, a child laughed in the distance. Flaxborough exhaled, untroubled again, and Purbright, walking through the hush, carried with him that faint, lingering scent of old paper and tobacco. No haunting now, only remembrance, folded neatly away with the rest of the town's secrets. The following week arrived with a fragile brightness, a watery sunlight that glimmered off the cobbles and gave the illusion of warmth. The rain had gone, leaving behind that faint smell of stone and paper that clings to old towns after cleansing weather. In the police station, Purbright sat by the window, pipe unlit, reading a short letter written in Miss Denby's precise, elegant hand. It was, as he expected, a resignation, graceful, unembellished, and perfectly courteous. "It has been my privilege," she wrote, "to serve the library for 27 years. I trust it will continue to offer the quiet refuge it has always provided, long after my presence is forgotten." Purbright folded the paper carefully and placed it back into its envelope. Outside, the lamplighter was making his morning round late, raising a stick to extinguish what little of the night still lingered in glass. The inspector smiled faintly. The world, it seemed, was returning to order in its own discreet fashion. When he arrived at the library that afternoon, he found Margaret alone at the counter. The space behind her looked changed, not by any rearrangement of books, but by a lightness in the air. The ghosts, it appeared, had gone. "Inspector," she said, and her smile, though hesitant, held a note of calm. "Miss Denby asked me to give you this." She handed him a small box, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside, neatly folded, lay a linen handkerchief embroidered with the initials A.D., and beside it a short note in the same careful script. "A small token, Inspector, in appreciation of your civility. Some truths are better faced with grace than resisted in fear. Please ensure the library remains a house of reason, not remorse." He closed the box gently. "A farewell, then?" Margaret nodded. "She left yesterday morning. Said she was visiting her sister near Scarborough. I think she meant not to return." "A pity," said Purbright softly. "Flaxborough grows poorer each time it loses one of its guardians of silence." He wandered through the reading room. The air smelled faintly of dust and polish, but beneath that lingered the softer trace of something human, a warmth left behind. Sunlight, weak but earnest, lay across the table where the Oxford Companion rested open once again. He smiled at that. The book had reclaimed its ordinary purpose. Turning back, he found Margaret watching him, her hands clasped before her like a student awaiting correction. "She taught me everything," she said, "even how to be afraid of the wrong things."
"I didn't understand until now." "You'll do well," Purbright said gently.
"You've the right mixture of diligence and doubt. It's a rare balance. Keep it." She hesitated. "Will there be a report?"
"About all this?"
He shook his head. "Only a note in my own file stating that the disturbance at the library was caused by overwork and sentimentality, two very English ailments, both curable with tea." That made her laugh quietly. "And what of the books, sir, the missing ones?" "They'll remain missing, I think," said Purbright.
"Every story needs a little mystery to keep it from fading completely."
"Let them be Lavery's memorial." She smiled again, grateful, and turned back to her work. The scratch of her pen against the register had a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat restored. Purbright lingered a moment longer, then reached for his hat. As he stepped outside, a light breeze stirred the square. The church clock struck 4, its mellow notes drifting across the rooftops. In the distance, a child's laughter carried faintly, then faded into the hum of the day. He paused beneath the elm where he had once kept his quiet vigil and looked back. Through the window he could see Margaret shelving books, her figure half illumined by a slant of afternoon sun. She moved without haste, confident now in her solitude. "New beginnings," Purbright murmured. "They seldom arrive loudly, but they do arrive." He walked on, his footsteps slow, measured, content. A shopkeeper nodded as he passed. The baker called a greeting. Somewhere, a kettle whistled in a back room. The town had resumed its ordinary music, the kind only those who listen closely ever truly hear. At the corner, a thin curl of pipe smoke drifted from a bench by the post office. Purbright stopped, amused by the coincidence, though he knew better than to attribute meaning to it. Still, as he drew his coat a little closer, he thought he caught that familiar scent, cherry blend, faint and sweet,
mingling with the autumn air. He smiled to himself and tipped his hat,
as though acknowledging an unseen companion. "Good afternoon, Mr. Lavery," he said softly. "You can rest easy now." And with that, he continued down the quiet street, the sound of his shoes mingling with the soft murmur of Flaxborough, the town that, for all its manners and mysteries, seemed always to find its way back to decency. The rain had ended hours ago, though its memory lingered, a thin gloss on the cobblestones, a freshness in the air that smelled faintly of moss and chimney soot. The town was settling into itself again, drawing its curtains, dimming its lamps, and returning to the rhythms that comforted it best. Evening in Flaxborough was never hurried. It simply folded over the day like a shawl, soft and inevitable. Inspector Purbright walked through the square, his shoes making a slow, hollow music against the damp stones. The gaslights flickered with that patient restraint peculiar to old towns, their glow turning the fog into a soft envelope. He moved easily within it, as if the night were an old acquaintance who required no conversation. The library stood ahead, its facade pale, untroubled, windows dark and secretive. There were no watchers now, no tales of books that wandered or voices that sighed among the shelves. The townsfolk had settled their own explanation. A draught, they said.
A trick of light, a bit of nonsense.
And so the matter had been laid to rest in that peculiarly English fashion, half believed, half forgotten, and entirely satisfying. He paused beneath the elm that bordered the square,
hands resting on his umbrella like a walking stick.
Through the misted glass, he thought he saw a faint reflection of movement, though he knew the building was empty. It was the echo of memory, perhaps. Margaret closing the desk for the night, Miss Denby's hand arranging a card catalogue one last time. He smiled to himself, a thin, thoughtful curve of the lips. "Ghosts," he murmured, "are remarkably punctual." The town clock struck 9. Its chime rolled out in long, patient intervals, a sound both melancholy and comforting, as if the air itself was sighing. Purbright resumed his walk, his silhouette briefly caught by the lamplight, before dissolving again into shadow. Past the stationers, the street narrowed toward the river, where the air grew cooler, touched with the metallic tang of water and wet iron. He stopped at the bridge rail and leaned slightly, watching the current take the reflections of lamps and stretch them thin. The flow was slow tonight, obedient and low, whispering against the stone in soft persuasion. Across the water, a single window burned with late light, a room above the grocer's. Margaret's, perhaps. He imagined her there, surrounded by her neat stacks of paper and her careful order, cataloguing not books now, but memories. It pleased him to think she would keep her ghosts tidy. From the opposite bank drifted the faintest scent of tobacco, sweet, unmistakably old-fashioned. Purbright's expression softened. "Still keeping watch, are you?" he said quietly into the fog. "I dare say you've chosen a better view." He stood a while longer, listening to the faint drip of water from the bridge arch, the low rumble of a train somewhere beyond the hill. Flaxborough's nights always sounded like this, muted, enduring, half forgotten, yet faithful to themselves. He could never quite decide whether the town lulled its sorrows to sleep or merely taught them better manners. When at last he turned back toward his lodgings, the street seemed narrower, more familiar. Curtains glowed faintly where families lingered over the remains of supper. He passed the butcher's, the scent of sawdust still clinging faintly to the damp threshold. The bakery, already dark, though the warmth of its oven still pulsed faintly against the glass. Outside the Green Man, two men in caps exchanged subdued goodnights, their voices softened by beer and habit. They nodded as Purbright passed, an acknowledgment without curiosity. The inspector preferred it that way. The best towns, he thought, were those that required no explanations, only continuations. By the time he reached his own street, the fog had thickened again, curling around the lamp-posts in pale spirals. He unlocked his door, stepped inside, and was met by the mild, familiar quiet of rooms that neither welcomed nor reproached him. The clock on the mantel ticked softly. The fire had burned itself low. He set his hat on the stand, shook the damp from his coat, and went to the hearth. There, beside the poker, lay the little box Miss Denby had sent, the one containing her note and the embroidered handkerchief. He had left it unopened since her departure, unsure why. Now he took it in his hands and lifted the lid. The linen inside caught the glow of the embers, its initials fine and deliberate. Beneath it lay a second sheet of paper, folded once. He opened it and read the brief line written there in her unmistakable script. "You were right, Inspector. It is not ghosts that haunt us, but the things we love too much to leave alone." He read it twice, then placed it gently back, closing the lid with quiet finality. The fire shifted, its last coal giving a sigh. He sat down, pipe in hand, but did not light it. Instead, he watched the smoke that wasn't there, tracing its imagined paths through the room, as though the air itself still remembered conversation. Outside, the town murmured softly in its sleep. A door clicked somewhere distant. A cartwheel rolled briefly along the lane. A dog barked once and was answered only by silence. The rain began again, fine, persistent, barely audible, its rhythm slow and unhurried, the sound of things continuing exactly as they must. Purbright rose at last, drew the curtains and let the faint lamplight fade. The town would wake tomorrow and talk of other matters, markets, parish notices, perhaps a council proposal about new shelving for the library. The ghost would remain, but only as a story told to visitors who smiled indulgently. That, he decided, was as it should be. He climbed the narrow stairs, paused at the landing window, and looked out once more toward the square. The library's roof was a shadow against the sky. Somewhere beyond it, the river whispered its ceaseless gossip to the stones. He felt, not for the first time, the odd tenderness that sometimes followed endings. Not sadness, precisely, but something finer, quieter, as though the world had exhaled and grown lighter for it. "Good night, Flaxborough," he said softly, and smiled to himself at the absurdity of speaking to a town. Yet as he turned away, he thought he heard the faintest echo in reply. A whisper, or perhaps just the wind stirring among the chimneys. Either way, it was enough. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.